Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. I'm going to continue reading Caliban and the Witch, Women, the Body, and Reproductive Accumulation by Silvia Federici, from where we left off last time, which was in chapter 2, Accumulation of Labor and Degradation of Women. And starting in this section called Land Privatization in Europe, the Production of Scarcity, and the Separation of Production from Reproduction. From the beginning of capitalism, the immiseration of the working class began with war and land privatization. This was an international phenomenon. By the mid-16th century, European merchants had expropriated much of the land of the Canary Islands and turned them into sugar plantations. The most massive process of land privatization and enclosure occurred in the Americas, where by the turn of the 17th century, 1/3 of the communal indigenous land had been appropriated by the Spaniards under the system of encomienda. Loss of land was also one of the consequences of slave raiding in Africa, which deprived many communities of the best among their youth. In Europe, land privatization began in the late 15th century, simultaneously with colonial expansion. It took different forms: the eviction of tenants, rent increases, and increased state taxation leading to debt and the sale of land. I define all these forms as land expropriation because, even when force was not used, the loss of land occurred against the individual's or the community's will and undermined their capacity for subsistence. Two forms of land expropriation must be mentioned: war, whose character changed in this period, being used as a means to transform territorial and economic arrangements, and religious reform. Before 1494, warfare in Europe had mainly consisted of minor wars characterized by brief and irregular campaigns. These often took place in the summer to give the peasants who formed the bulk of the armies the time to sow their crops. Armies confronted each other for long periods of time without much action. But by the 16th century, wars became more frequent, and a new type of warfare appeared, in part because of technological innovation, but mostly because the European states began to turn to territorial conquest to resolve their economic crisis, and wealthy financiers invested in it. Military campaigns became much longer. Armies grew tenfold, and they became permanent and professionalized. Mercenaries were hired, who had no attachment to the local population, and the goal of warfare became the elimination of the enemy, so that war left in its wake deserted villages, fields covered with corpses, famines, and epidemics, as in Albert Durer's The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. This phenomenon, whose traumatic impact on the population is reflected in numerous artistic representations, changed the agricultural landscape of Europe. Okay, here's a woodcut by Jacques Caillot, The Horrors of War. The men hanged by military authorities were former soldiers turned robbers. Dismissed soldiers were a large part of the vagabonds and beggars that crowded the roads of 17th century Europe. Many tenure contracts were also annulled when the Church's lands were confiscated in the course of the Protestant Reformation, which began with a massive land grab by the upper class. In France, a common hunger for the Church's land at first united the lower and higher classes in the Protestant movement, but when the land was auctioned, starting in 1563, the artisans and day laborers who had demanded the expropriation of the Church with a passion born of bitterness and hope, and had mobilized with the promise that they too would receive their share, were betrayed in their expectations. Also, the peasants who had become Protestant to free themselves from tithes were deceived. When they stood by their rights, declaring that the gospel promises land, freedom, and enfranchisement, they were savagely attacked as fomenters of sedition. In England as well, much land changed hands in the name of religious reform. W.G. Hoskin has described it as the greatest transference of land in English history since the Norman Conquest, or more succinctly, as the Great Plunder. In England, however, land privatization was mostly accomplished through the enclosures, a phenomenon that has become so associated with the expropriation of workers from their common wealth that in our time it is used by anti-capitalist activists as a signifier for every attack on social entitlements. In the 16th century, enclosure was a technical term, indicating a set of strategies the English lords and rich farmers used to eliminate communal land property and expand their holdings. It mostly referred to the abolition of the open field system, an arrangement by which villagers owned non-contiguous strips of land in a non-hedged field. Enclosing also included the fencing off of the commons and the pulling down of the shacks of poor cottagers who had no land but could survive because they had access to customary rights. Large tracts of land were also enclosed to create deer parks, while entire villages were cast down to be laid to pasture. Though the enclosures continued into the 18th century, even before the Reformation, more than 2,000 rural communities were destroyed in this way. So severe was the extinction of rural villages that in 1518 and again in 1548, the Crown called for an investigation. But despite the appointment of several royal commissions, little was done to stop the trend. What began instead was an intense struggle, climaxing in numerous uprisings, accompanied by a long debate on the merits and demerits of land privatization, which is still continuing today, revitalized by the World Bank's assault on the last planetary commons. Briefly put, the argument proposed by modernizers from all political perspectives is that the enclosures boosted agricultural efficiency and the dislocations they produced were well compensated by a significant increase in agricultural productivity. It is claimed that the land was depleted, and if it had remained in the hands of the poor, it would have ceased to produce, anticipating Garrett Hardin's Tragedy of the Commons, while its takeover by the rich allowed it to rest. Coupled with agricultural innovation, the argument goes, the enclosures made the land more productive, leading to the expansion of the food supply. From this viewpoint, any praise for communal land tenure is dismissed as nostalgia for the past, the assumption being that agricultural communalism is backward and inefficient, and that those who defend it are guilty of an undue attachment to tradition. That sounds silly. But these arguments do not hold. Land privatization and the commercialization of agriculture did not increase the food supply available to the common people. though more food was made available for the market and for export. For workers, they inaugurated 2 centuries of starvation. In the same way as today, even in the most fertile areas of Africa, Asia, and Latin America, malnutrition is rampant due to the destruction of communal land tenure and the export or perish policy imposed by the World Bank's structural adjustment programs. Nor did the introduction of new agricultural techniques in England compensate for this loss. On the contrary, the development of agrarian capitalism worked hand in glove with the impoverishment of the rural population. A testimony to the misery produced by land privatization is the fact that barely a century after the emergence of agrarian capitalism, 60 European towns had instituted some form of social assistance or were moving in this direction, and vagabondage had become an international problem. Population growth may have been a contributing factor, but its importance has been overstated and should be circumscribed in time. By the last part of the 16th century, almost everywhere in Europe, the population was stagnating or declining, but this time workers did not derive any benefit from the change. There are also misconceptions about the effectiveness of the open field system of agriculture. Neoliberal historians have described it as wasteful, but even a supporter of land privatization like Jean de Vries recognizes that the communal use of agriculture fields has many advantages. It protected the peasants from harvest failure due to the variety of strips to which a family had access. It also allowed for a manageable work schedule since each strip required attention at a different time, and it encouraged a democratic way of life built on self-government and self-reliance, since all decisions, when to plant or harvest, when to drain the fens, how many animals to allow in the commons, were taken by peasant assemblies. Okay, here is a 16th century engraving by Daniel Hopper. Of a rural feast. All the festivals, games, and gatherings of the peasant community were held on the commons. Just think about what the loss of a place like that means. You have a place like this where you do everything. That's how you have communities from this space, this outdoor space. That's so cool and good and like beneficial for like building community, which helps you be strong as a people to like not let governments just boss you around, and then the government just like takes away that space from you. That's like a huge blow. The same considerations apply to the commons. Disparaged in 16th century literature as a source of laziness and disorder, the commons were essential to the reproduction of many small farmers or cotters who survived only because they had access to meadows in which to keep cows, or woods in which to gather timber, wild berries and herbs, or quarries, fish ponds, and open spaces in which to meet. Beside encouraging collective decision-making and work cooperation, the commons were the material foundation upon which peasant solidarity and sociality could thrive. All the festivals, games, and gatherings of the peasant community were held on the commons. The social function of the commons was especially important for women, who, having less title to land and less social power, were more dependent on them for their subsistence, autonomy, and sociality. Paraphrasing Alice Clark's statement about the importance of markets for women in pre-capitalist Europe, we can say that the commons, too, were for women the center of social life, the place where they convened, exchanged news, took advice, and where a woman's viewpoint on communal events, autonomous from that of men, could form. This web of cooperative relations, which R.D. Tawney has referred to as the primitive communism of the feudal village, crumbled when the open field system was abolished, and the communal lands were fenced off. Not only did cooperation in agricultural labor die when land was privatized, and individual labor contracts replaced collective ones, economic differences among the rural population deepened as the number of poor squatters increased who had nothing left but a cot and a cow, and no choice but to go with bended knee and cap in hand to beg for a job. Social cohesion broke down, families disintegrated, the youth left the village to join the increasing number of vagabonds or itinerant workers, soon to become the social problem of the age, while the elderly were left behind to fend for themselves. Particularly disadvantaged were older women, who, no longer supported by their children, fell onto the poor rolls, or survived by borrowing, petty theft, and delayed payments. That's literally how I survive right now. The outcome was a peasantry polarized not only by the deepening economic inequalities, but by a web of hatred and resentments that is well documented in the records of the witch hunt, which shows that quarrels relating to requests for help, the trespassing of animals, or unpaid rents were in the background of many accusations. The enclosures also undermined the economic situation of the artisans, in the same way in which multinational corporations take advantage of the peasants expropriated from their lands by the World Bank to construct free export zones. This is tea, where commodities are produced at the lowest cost. So, in the 16th and 17th centuries, merchant capitalists took advantage of the cheap labor force that had been made available in the rural areas to break the power of the urban guilds and destroy the artisans' independence. This was especially the case in the textile industry that was reorganized as a rural cottage industry, and on the basis of the putting out system, the ancestor of today's informal economy, also built on the labor of women and children. But textile workers were not the only ones whose labor was cheapened. As soon as they lost access to land, all workers were plunged into a dependence unknown in medieval times, as their landless condition gave employers the power to cut their pay and lengthen the working day. In Protestant areas, this happened under the guise of religious reform, which doubled the work year by eliminating the saints' days. Not surprisingly, with land expropriation came a change in the workers' attitude towards the wage. While in the Middle Age, wages could be viewed as an instrument of freedom, in contrast to the compulsion of the labor services. As soon as access to land came to an end, wages began to be viewed as instruments of enslavement. Such was the hatred that workers felt for wage labor that Gerard Winstanley, the leader of the Diggers, declared that it did not make any difference whether one lived under the enemy or under one's brother, if one worked for a wage. Hell yeah. This explains the growth in the wake of the enclosures, using the term in a broad sense to include all forms of land privatization, of the number of vagabonds and masterless men who preferred to take to the road and risk enslavement or death, as prescribed by the bloody legislation passed against them, rather than to work for a wage. It also explains the strenuous struggle which peasants made to defend their land from expropriation, no matter how meager its size. In England, anti-enclosure struggles began in the late 15th century and continued throughout the 16th and 17th, when leveling the enclosing hedges became the most common species of social protest and the symbol of class conflict. Anti-enclosure riots often turned into mass uprisings. The most notorious was Kett's Rebellion, named after its leader Robert Kett, that took place in Norfolk in 1549. This was no small nocturnal affair. At its peak, the rebels numbered 16,000, had an artillery, defeated a government army of 12,000, and even captured Norwich, at the time the second largest city in England. They also drafted a program that, if realized, would have checked the advance of agrarian capitalism and eliminated all vestiges of feudal power in the country. It consisted of 29 demands that Ket, a farmer and tanner, presented to the Lord Protector. The first was that, from henceforth, no man shall enclose any more. Other articles demanded that rents should be reduced to the rates that had prevailed 65 years before, that all freeholders and copyholders may take the profits of all commons, and that all bondmen may be made free, for God made all free with his precious blood shedding. These demands were put into practice. Throughout Norfolk, enclosing hedges were uprooted, and only when another government army attacked them were the rebels stopped. 3,500 were slain in the massacre that followed. Hundreds more were wounded. Ket and his brother William were hanged outside Norwich's walls. Anti-enclosure struggles continued, however, through the Jacobean period, with a noticeable increase in the presence of women. During the reign of James I, about 10% of enclosure riots included women among the rebels. Some were all-female protests. In 1607, for instance, 37 women, led by a Captain Dorothy, she sounds hot, attacked coal miners working on what women claimed to be the village commons in Thorpemore, Yorkshire. "40 women went to cast down the fences and hedges of an enclosure in Waddingham in 1608, and in 1609 on a manor in Dunchurch, 15 women, including wives, widows, spinsters, unmarried daughters, and servants, took it upon themselves to assemble at night to dig up the hedges and level the ditches." Again, at York in May 1624, women destroyed an enclosure and went to prison for it. They were said to have enjoyed tobacco and ale after their feat. Then, in 1641, a crowd that broke into an enclosed fen at Buckden consisted mainly of women aided by boys. And these were just a few instances of a confrontation in which women holding pitchforks and scythes resisted the fencing of the land or the draining of the fens when their livelihood was threatened. This strong female presence has been attributed to the belief that women were above the law, being covered legally by their husbands. Even men, we are told, dressed like women to pull up the fences. But this explanation should not be taken too far, for the government soon eliminated this privilege and started arresting and imprisoning women involved in anti-enclosure riots. Moreover, we should not assume that women had no stake of their own in the resistance to land expropriation. The opposite was the case. As with the commutation, women were those who suffered most when the land was lost and the village community fell apart. Part of the reason is that it was far more difficult for them to become vagabonds or migrant workers, for a nomadic life exposed them to male violence, especially at a time when misogyny was escalating. Women were also less mobile on account of pregnancies and the caring of children, a fact overlooked by scholars who consider the flight from servitude through migration and other forms of nomadism the paradigmatic forms of struggle. Nor could women become soldiers for pay, though some joined armies as cooks, washers, prostitutes, and wives. But by the 17th century, this option too vanished, as armies were further regimented and the crowds of women that used to follow them were expelled from the battlefields. Women were also more negatively impacted by the enclosures, because as soon as land was privatized and monetary relations began to dominate economic life, they found it more difficult than men to support themselves, being increasingly confined to reproductive labor at the very time when this work was being completely devalued. As we will see, This phenomenon, which has accompanied the shift from a subsistence to a money economy in every phase of capitalist development, can be attributed to several factors. It is clear, however, that the commercialization of economic life provided the material conditions for it. Here's a picture by Hans Sebald Beham from 1530, entitled Women and Knaves. The train of women that we used to follow the armies even to the battlefield. The women, including wives and prostitutes, took care of the reproduction of the soldiers. Notice the women wearing a muzzling device. Christ. With the demise of the subsistence economy that had prevailed in pre-capitalist Europe, the unity of production and reproduction, which has been typical of all societies based on production for use, came to an end, as these activities became the carriers of different social relations and were sexually differentiated. In the new monetary regime, only production for market was defined as a value-creating activity, whereas the reproduction of the worker began to be considered as valueless from an economic viewpoint, and even ceased to be considered as work. Reproductive work continued to be paid, though at the lowest rates, when performed for the master class or outside the home. But the economic importance of the reproduction of labor power carried out in the home, and its function in the accumulation of capital, became invisible, being mystified as a natural vocation and labeled women's labor. In addition, women were excluded from many waged occupations, and when they worked for a wage, they earned a pittance compared to the average male wage. These historic changes that peaked in the 19th century with the creation of the full-time housewife redefined women's positions in society and in relation to men. The sexual division of labor that emerged from it not only fixed women to reproductive work, but increased their dependence on men, enabling the state and employers to use the male wage as a means to command women's labor. In this way, the separation of commodity production from the reproduction of labor power also made possible the development of the specifically capitalist use of the wage and of the markets as means for the accumulation of unpaid labor. Most importantly, the separation of production from reproduction created a class of proletarian women who were as dispossessed as men, but unlike their male relatives, in a society that was becoming increasingly monetarized, had almost no access to wages, thus being forced into a condition of chronic poverty, economic dependence, and invisibility as workers. As we will see, the devaluation and feminization of reproductive labor was a disaster also for male workers, for the devaluation of reproductive labor inevitably devalued its product, labor power. But there is no doubt that in the transition from feudalism to capitalism, women suffered a unique process of social degradation that was fundamental to the accumulation of capital and has remained so ever since. Also, in view of these developments, we cannot say then that the separation of the worker from the land and the advent of a money economy realized the struggle which the medieval serfs had fought to free themselves from bondage. It was not the workers, male or female, who were liberated by land privatization. What was liberated was capital, as the land was now free to function as a means of accumulation and exploitation rather than as a means of subsistence. Liberated were the landlords, who now could unload onto the workers most of the cost of their reproduction, giving them access to some means of subsistence only when directly employed. When work would not be available or would not be sufficiently profitable, as in times of commercial or agricultural crisis, workers instead could be laid off and left to starve. The separation of workers from their means of subsistence and their new dependence on monetary relations also meant that the real wage could now be cut, and women's labor could be further devalued with respect to men's through monetary manipulation. It is not a coincidence, then, that as soon as land began to be privatized, the prices of foodstuffs, which for 2 centuries had stagnated, began to rise. I'm quitting. But this shit is crazy. Okay, thank you for watching this video. Please like, comment, and subscribe for more. Let me know if you have any requests, but I'm probably trying to read Maria Mies Patriarchy and Accumulation on a World Scale next. So yeah, thank you guys so much for watching. See you later.